Rice Science Partnership. Now, I'm not expecting that all of you are familiar with the restructuring of the CGRR system that has taken place in recent years, or at least not to the level of detail that we are who are involved. But the key point there is that we now have 15 CGR research programs of global nature. And the very first one that got established and became effective January 1st, 2011 was GRIS, or the Global Rice Science Partnership, which is now essentially the overall umbrella for all of the work we do on rice in the CGR system and with all the partners that are involved. So in this particular program, as you can see, in addition to IRRI, Africa Rice, Sierra, IRD, and JIRCAS, who have an international mandate for development research, we have already something like 900 research and development partners worldwide. Of course, many of you, one way or another, directly or indirectly involved in projects there. There's a website indicated up there, gris.net, that we use as an information and communication portal for this. What I wanted to point out is that this is really for the first time an effort to have a more coherent and, if you wish, single research strategy at the international level on all aspects of rice development. And so we have a 5-year work and business plan and structured into 6 themes that range from resources, so the basic sciences on gene discovery and other things, all the way down to the delivery of technologies to farmers. And what I want to point out here is that we are really trying to implement a more product-oriented or outcome-oriented R&D approach. So we have, in fact, a total of 94 R&D products under these different themes. And they're clustered in so-called product lines. And you can see these 6 product lines we have under the breeding theme, new varietal development. We have a mechanism that's still much smaller than I would like it to be on new frontiers research that are geared towards to bringing in new partners, particularly also in the upstream research side. We have a scholarship program. The funding for this is essentially a combination of money that is given by donors to the central CGR windows, but the bulk of it, 2/3, is still coming from specific bilateral or multilateral research grants that we are able to develop and raise funding for. What we obviously need from the point of our mission is that we have to really accelerate development of new varieties as part of the overall impact pathway for farmers, and that obviously requires strong integration with the genetics research and also really taking both of them to a whole new level. So at IRRI, we have just started earlier this year, for that reason, a pretty significant transformation of our breeding programs towards product-oriented variety development pipelines. There are 7 of those right now with different ecology targets and regional targets, where we have really defined now much more precisely, or we're in the process of doing this, what the specific product profiles need to be, and then also the trade packages needed for different market segments or environmental segments, or intersections of both. And that then becomes the driving factor for organizing the varietal development pipelines and the trade development pipelines and other cross-cutting functions across these programs. In a way, this is an attempt to rationalize breeding, but the main point is that we want to do breeding faster, more precisely. We want to have better varieties coming out much quicker and a more targeted way to those places where they need to go. And that requires, obviously, a massive acceleration of the gene discovery research for trade development. So one of the key initiatives or product lines under the GRISP is product line 1.2, which gene pools. So this is where, in our context, all of the work on genotyping, phenotyping, genotype-phenotype associations for gene discovery falls in to really accelerate the discovery of valuable genes for the range of different traits that we need in breeding. So for us, this product line is a very significant component, and as Ken has already mentioned, or many of you know, there has been in the past already a number of activities on sequencing, and he has mentioned in particularly also the new 3K de novo sequencing effort. And I just want to add to that that it's also an interesting example for how such a big effort was made possible by actually pooling sources of funding from a variety of sources. In that case, a substantial amount of funding comes from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation through the Green Superrise project. There is significant funding from China, the Ministry of Science and Technology in there. There's even funding from the local government of Shenzhen. And then there's contributions that the participating institutions make, so IRIC, CAS, and BGI. Because obviously this is a big undertaking, but it's an example for what you can possibly accomplish if you really have a clear vision and you pool the resources necessary. What we are starting now to build much more is the phenotyping side. So in the GRISP, we also have now established at least the first stages of a global phenotyping network. And I'm just showing this slide primarily to illustrate just the scale that we expect this phenotyping work ultimately to take on. So what you see here is just the beginnings, I would say, where we had to select a few yield-related traits, a few environment adaptation traits, and we already differentiate between tropical Japhonicas and Indicas. And then different places and protocols and institutions. So you can imagine that this is going to be the major work in the future, and is also going to be the work that is producing massive amounts of information that one way or another need to be brought together with the genotyping side. So we're in the process of establishing this trace scanning system, for example, for high resolution scanning. We're in the process of having various field-based scanning devices like this 3D imaging PhenoMobile developed in collaboration, or primarily led by CSIRO. And I think it's a whole new dimension of information that we all need to learn what to do with this in the end. I was told, we had a workshop not a few weeks ago, I was told that a machine like this would probably produce several hundred terabytes of data in a normal growing season. So what on earth are we going to do with all that? Does all of that make sense? How are we going to process it? You know? What can you really do with it in terms of trait discovery? You know? Lots of things to learn, but the writing is on the wall. We're going to have a massive flood of technology and data to process, and we also need to learn to make sense of this. And that's where we believe different organizations, both in the public and private sector, need to pool together. It's going to be a challenge if we try to do each of us ourselves in a small group here and there. None of us is going to have the critical mass, even the intellectual power to do this. And so we have partners like BGI and Shenzhen who have at their fingertips armies of people like those here who can process bioinformatics data. Who else can have that? I don't have that many people at IRRI who can do this, and most of you don't have it either. You have 1,500 bioinformaticians? Something like this?
Yeah, close to 1,000.
1,000. So we have to bring these different resources together if we want to succeed. And we need mechanisms for this, obviously. So from looking at this from the distance, and as I said at the very beginning, I'm not really deeply entrenched or involved in this community, but just from my angle when I look at this. I think that's kind of what I'm seeing. So we have at the moment lots of valuable individual efforts in the public and private sector on both sides, but they're not really fully connected. There is some curated information already available, also in seed sources. Ken has shown those. I think there is some still general uncertainties often about the IP situations, different interpretation of treaty rules, particularly by private companies that we're interacting with, which complicates matters in terms of sharing materials. I think we have, in general, a research community of practice, I would say, that goes way back to the Internationalized Functional Genomics Consortium, and also many joint projects. This community has many different strengths and needs. That's normal. But there is no globally coordinated rights informatics portal that meets all of these needs and also has a sustainable funding mechanism. We cannot overemphasize how important this is going to be, because we're going to be in this game for many years to come. And the exponential rise in information that we all are aware of is going to just scale these things up to a level that we probably cannot quite even imagine. And we have really also to consider that rice is probably different from Arabidopsis, because it is a commercial crop. And there are increasingly sophisticated needs of rice breeding and also rising investments in the private sector. So when we create a consortium like this, this is going to be, in my opinion, one of the most important things to consider. And we see it already in the changes in the rice seed value chain that have taken place in recent years. Until 5-10 years ago, there was very little private sector investment in the rice seed industry. But it has risen really a lot, particularly, of course, driven by the interest in hybrid rice. So we have many more breeding companies nowadays, we have many more seed companies, and of course the processing industry at the end of the value chain is also increasingly demanding certain things to breed for or grow for. So this is a new environment that we need to deal with. And it's actually good, because I believe it's going to benefit small farmers that are, at least from IRRI's point of view, are the primary target for us. And it's going to accelerate the access to high quality varieties. But we need to find ways to really have good functioning public-private partnerships. What we often see, or what I sometimes hear also people complaining, is this. The private sector has access to all of our knowledge that we have in the public sector, but the knowledge in the private sector is largely not accessible to the public sector. Now, true or not true, I'm not going to argue about this, but if we create a consortium like this that involves public and private sector, which I think it should, we must find ways to make this work. And my own experience in recent years, where we have had much more relationships with private companies, I think I would summarize this, that if you want to make this work, first of all, you need to have a common vision and a long-term commitment, not just sort of thinking a year or two. It requires that you need to have, on both ends, a clear understanding of what your products and mutual benefits are. I think the private sector also needs to realize that it is worthwhile to invest in public goods, even if those do not always have an immediate economic benefit or short-term value, but over the longer term they will have. I felt that trust, real contributions by both sides, good communication and strong personal relationships go a long way in making these things work. That is, to me, almost the most important thing, and you don't need lawyers if you have that kind of basis. But nevertheless, it's useful to have transparent governance, clear guidelines, agreements, and standard operational procedures in place. I'm saying that because all of those have to be elements of such a consortium. And you need to be willing to learn and adjust, improve things over time. because you come up with something to start with, but it's not going to be perfect. Speaking of IRRI, in the last 5 years, we have greatly expanded our relationships with the private sector, and we are following different models. I'm not going to go through all of those, but they have all been trying to follow the kind of principles that I showed on the previous slide. Where can we do something useful together, and then have the appropriate mechanism to do it. Not all of them have been equally successful. We've also, I think, sometimes had too high expectations on either side that we couldn't quite meet. But overall, we're learning. And I think there's a number of good experiences that we can draw on also when we talk about designing this potential consortium. The one example that I will talk a little bit in the next 2 or 3 slides is the Hybrid Rice Development Consortium. Hybrid rice, with the exception of China, where it has always been widespread since the mid-1980s and is covering about 60% of the rice there. It had a very slow time of pickup outside of China. And you can see for 20 years, or 10 years, let's say, not much happened. But in recent years, we have seen a substantial increase, and particularly in a few countries, India standing out, where this year it's going to be well over 2 million hectares probably. But also a number of others, including down here in the US, and that of course was primarily the work of Rice Tech. So we see hybrid rice as a substantial forward-looking technology that will have more influence. We were facing the problem so that when until about 2005-06, we had public sector funding for hybrid rice research, and then essentially it dried out. So the question was, did we have a continued role in hybrid rice development, knowing that the private sector ultimately is going to be the ones who have to lead this and take hybrids to farmers? And this is how, around 2007, we started the discussion of forming a hybrid rice development consortium. And it has 4 or 5 major objectives. One is to enhance the collaboration between public and private sector in hybrid rice development. And so it also then is a mechanism to support research for parent and hybrid development. So on certain traits, but primarily also develop valuable parental lines that then could be used by both public and private sector breeding programs. It provides information on the performance of hybrids and best management practices. So we run a multi-location trial, for example, and it's a platform for information sharing. So, and capacity building as well. So these were the main objectives, and we also needed to have, for us, a sustainable mechanism to fund this, because otherwise it would have run out after a couple of years, and public donors were not willing to invest in hybrid rice research anymore. So these were the objectives when it was created. And the mechanisms that we have used, so this particular one is a membership organization with public and private sector members. And you can see there's 3 categories of members right now. Private sector companies in 2 categories, A or B. You must sign up as a member for a minimum of 5 years. You cannot just drop out after 1 year. And if you sign up for category A, you're paying $30,000 a year. For B, $10,000. The difference is that if you're at that level, you have access to more germplasm for free. If you're at the lower level, you get a certain number for free, and the other ones you have to pay a standard development fee. Public sector doesn't pay any membership fees. We have encouraged donations, but of course none of them have come. So that's the reality. It has become the primary mechanism to regulate access, in this case to IRRI hybrid rice germplasm, including new access routes which we did not have before. So what we are allowing these hybrid rice breeders to do now is once or twice a year they can come and actually do direct selections of early stage materials in our nurseries. In the past, they would have never gotten that material, even segregating things. Why are we doing this? Because we believe it's a very effective mechanism to actually spread the use of germplasm, rather than wasting it. We may be selecting a few things, the rest waste. A breeder from a company from another country may find actually some of these things very useful. So that has been a new mechanism. The main condition is that you can only now get IRRI hybridized germplasm if you are a member of this consortium. So that has, I think, been quite a mind shift. So we have other mechanisms, annual meeting, website, multi-location trial. We get a lot of feedback from the communication with the companies and the other public partners and what is needed. And there are some specific research projects, and there's an annual hybridized training course. The way it's managed is pretty simple. It doesn't have a very complicated structure. It just has an IRRI coordinator and a support person, only one person actually, and a small advisory committee which is elected for 2-year terms and then rotates. And there's the IRRI program leader, 3 private sector and 2 public sector members in there. Now what has been the impact? This is where we were in 2007, before we started this, in terms of sharing hybrid germplasm. And it had gone down to very low numbers, about 300 a year accession sets of samples. 2005 is when our last public sector funded hybridized project ended. So you can see the impact of that. We started the consortium in 2008. By the end of 2008, we had 38 members. At present, it's 64. That's 32 private sector members right now and 32 public sector members. And you can see the flow of germplasm out of IRRI to these partners has increased over this few years by a factor of 10. So will it continue that way forever? We don't know. It will only continue if this is useful and if we have the right kind of product. There were also some, I think, expectations that we could not meet. We still need to make a lot of improvements in how the whole thing operates. But in principle, it has accelerated the access to materials and information, the interaction among the different hybridized players. And it's taken the game to a new level. So I think it's been successful. And it provides at this point probably 2/3 of the money that we need to run our hybridized breeding program in IRRI. Still not complete, but it's been a substantial way of getting a sustainable activity going there. So for establishing RISE Informatics Consortium, so in my view, things that we need to consider is, first of all, we need to have clarity about the scope. So what is it that it's supposed to do in terms of the components and products and services? So Ken has already, in his previous presentation, pointed out a number of these things. I'll come back to that. And then we need to agree on what the guiding principles are that we must follow, which then form the basis for options for the consortium model to consider. We don't want to prescribe this, but we want to get feedback on this. And once we have that, I think we can start developing a business plan that then in more detail spells out the components, the roles and responsibilities, the government and management mechanisms, the IT, the staffing needs, the location, and what funding mechanisms we will need. So now coming to the components, I think from the feedback that we already had from various people, it seems to me that there's a general agreement that there has to be some kind of managed information, communication, collaboration portal for RISE. And I'm putting the emphasis on managed. Somebody needs to be taking care of that. People. So that is relevant, up to date, and has the right stuff, that the quality is good. It's not enough just to throw things once in a while on the website. You've got to have it structured and managed well. So, and what could be those things that need to be on their long list of things? On the genome side, on the phenotypic information, and that probably in the future may even be the biggest volume, is my hypothesis, because it's very expensive to get it, and it's still going to be expensive compared to the declining cost of genome typing. You may want to have specialized software tools for RISE. You must have the ability to make DNA or seed samples available to purified seed stocks that have been used in this work, so that others can really dig deeper if they want. A repository of other things would be used for it. I think we'd like to have an integration, or as somebody put it in a response, a soft, a light link with other portals and databases. And I think we also then like to have, of course, regular interactions, and that could, in addition to larger meetings, also mean forming specific groups, and also then the ability to develop joint research projects that involve more organizations from both of the public and the private sector. So the guiding principles, and I've just put those down last night, so don't expect anything very deeply thought through there, but I just sort of sat down thinking, okay, what should be some of the principles, you know? And they're not, definitely not complete or in the right order. I think one principle has to be, anybody who is a member of that must contribute something. You can't just join a club and take everything. You know? You got to contribute something. That is essential to me, because you will only make this work if there is some kind of interdependence, and that requires that you've got to contribute money, data, people, or all of it at best, something like that. I think we all agree that for the genotyping data, we want to make those widely and freely available. At least those that don't really use proprietary material or so. And the Toronto Workshop Data Release Guidelines, I've been told, seem to be the ones that most of you are happy with. But I'm not the expert. I don't claim that, but that seems to be maybe a principle to follow. For the phenotyping data, I think the game will be a little bit different. So we may be wanting to consider that as a principle, access to phenotyping information and some other resources may be differentiated, depending on member categories or ownerships or whatever, which would be implemented essentially through some kind of login type of system. I'm just throwing this out. So I think I mentioned this before. As a principle, information must be up to date, high quality, and easily accessible and searchable. That means it must be curated and user friendly. To me, absolutely essential. Because you don't really only want to have specialists using that stuff. You know? Ultimately, you want breeders starting to use these kind of things, these resources. And the breeders that I work with are not really that keen on spending hours and hours trying to dig through complicated databases. They want things that they really are at their fingertips and make sense. So curation and user-friendliness to me are big principles. Another principle I think is that seed must be made available if it is not underlying any particular restrictions by the owner or the country that owns that. There must be clear rules of data ownership, data release, publications. And we all know that these can be very sticky issues. So clear rules as part of the constitution or whatever we call it have to be there. If you're a member, that means you're signing on to those rules. And you follow them. What those rules are, we can debate. And I believe we need to have multiple mechanisms to support this. I'm hoping that we can raise enough interest to have some sponsors, let's call them sponsors, not just donors, who help us to get it going, but also maybe over the longer time support it. But I also believe that we must have, certainly for private sector members, a certain fee structure and some basic cost recovery mechanisms also for all members. For example, if for the whole question of seed, there is handling fees needed. So if you purify seed, if you grow it out, if you multiply it and purify it and you ship it, there's a cost. So anybody wanting to have that seed must be willing to at least pay a decent price for this. I think other than that, and that refers to the public sector as well. So it's just a common sense act. So multiple ways of sponsoring this. I put down here the TAR, the Arabidopsis model, and the Hypergrowth Consortium one. So the difference with the Arabidopsis one, from what I understand, is primarily relying on sponsors. So both public and private companies. Whereas here we have a fee-based structure. So it could be both, it could be a hybrid of both. So whatever we find is most suitable. And it needs to have a very transparent governance and management system as another principle. So how could that look like? So I, again, sketched this out last night, just thinking, okay, how can we make this reasonably simple? So we have on top the Global Rice Science Partnership, which is just sort of the overall umbrella under which we would like to see this, of course, because of the overarching global role it has. The IRIC would then have most likely some kind of coordinator in the small management team. IRRI is offering to play that role. It would be largely a facilitating role, but somebody has to do it. You would have members. I think it should have some kind of steering committee that is composed of selected members and then rotates around. And we would like to have a science advisory panel too. And these should be, by and large, people who are not really directly involved in the rice-related work, but actually can bring in know-how from the wider genomics and phenomics community working on crops, and not even crops, maybe even other things. So that we get expertise from that end that we don't normally, that we don't always have if we just work on rice. So these would be the major bodies that we could have, and then of course there could be associated partners involved in certain research. We would have hopefully some specific projects and linkages with other genomics and information portals, such as Grameen, for example. So this is one way to possibly structure that and manage it. It's just what I came up with. Whether that is the best way, whether it makes sense, I cannot tell. So what would be the steps to take? So the first step, and that's essentially the beginning here today, is to collect some feedback from both public and private sector on what you would like to see, how you would like to have it. That's the main thing. So then use this feedback to analyze the various options, maybe if needed seek some more advice, and define the products and services and principles pretty clearly, and come up with a draft proposal for IRIC as a public-private consortium, with including then already as much as fairly detailed guidelines on the membership rules and all of the other things that are listed. So that document is obviously needed, which then needs to be reviewed and fine-tuned, and then hopefully is acceptable. We would then like to take that, or maybe even at an earlier stage already, to a number of potential supporters, hoping that we you can raise at least a decent level of startup funds that I believe will be needed to particularly create the necessary staffing and IT infrastructure for that. You need to have a few people doing this. And you need to have whatever it takes in terms of hardware and software. And so for that, I think an initial amount of money will be needed, but my IRRI colleagues know that my philosophy is very simple. If you have a good idea, I'm pretty sure that you will find the money for it. If you don't have a good idea, then don't expect money to come to you. So, but I think this is a good idea, and I think we will have support. And of course, we would like to sign up members and hopefully launch and implement the whole thing. And I'm hoping that all of that should happen still this year, if possible, even faster. So I'll leave it at that, and I think what I would like to do is just open this all up for discussion. And we have enough time. We can go around pretty much the whole room of those who want to speak. And what I would like to get from you is primarily feedback on, I'm assuming we don't really need to discuss whether that makes sense or not. I think general view seems to be that one way or another something like that needs to happen. I've also heard that other communities working on other crops, wheat and maize and whatever, probably have similar needs, or maybe thinking along similar lines, you know. So one way or another, it has to be done, I think. So what I would like to get feedback is primarily, you know, what are the specific things, the specific suggestions you would like to have in terms of priorities of components and content, and also the operational mechanisms or any good ideas you might have on the structure and governance and financial support for such a thing. So, who would like to start?
I would say a few things about the background.
Turn around a little bit so that everybody can hear. Introduce yourself.
Okay, I'll use the microphone. Okay.